By 1970, the LS6 Chevelle was carrying the title that mattered most in American performance, the most powerful muscle car ever built. 450 horsepower on the factory paperwork, 500 pound-feet of torque, solid lifter camshaft, 11.25-to-1 compression, and a price that reminded you General Motors was serious about this engine being the answer to everything on the street. That was the official story, and it was true as far as it went. The part of the story nobody was supposed to tell is what happened when you ran an LS6 Chevelle against a Buick. Not a Corvette, not a Camaro, a Buick. A car that General Motors had specifically positioned as the respectable choice. The family brand, the car your insurance agent drove, the car that was absolutely, definitively not supposed to be in this fight. And when car and driver put both cars on the same strip on the same day, the Buick ran a 13.38. The LS6 Chevelle ran a 13.76. This is the Buick GSX Stage 1 versus the LS6 Chevelle 454. The car GM didn't want you to know about against the car GM told you was the best they had. And the reason you've never heard this story told straight is because General Motors worked very hard to make sure you wouldn't. To understand the full weight of what the Stage 1 did, you need to understand what the LS6 was. This was not a regular Chevelle option. The LS6 was the engine Chevrolet's racing department had been building toward since the mid-1960s, a 454 cubic inch big block with a forged steel crankshaft, forged connecting rods, solid lifter camshaft, and an 11.25-to-1 compression ratio that required premium fuel and delivered the kind of power that made insurance actuaries revise their entire risk models for American passenger cars. Factory rating, 450 horsepower at 5,600 revolutions per minute, 500 pound-feet of torque at 3,600 revolutions per minute, a 780 cubic feet per minute Holley 4-barrel carburetor on an aluminum intake manifold. The LS6 package added heavy-duty suspension, a Muncie 4-speed or turbo hydromatic transmission, and a rear axle that could survive repeated full-throttle launches without rearranging its own internal geometry. Car and driver ran a 1970 LS6 Chevelle to a 13.76 second quarter mile at 102.7 miles per hour in near-factory trim. Motor Trend tested 1 and got 13.81 at 101.6. Road Test Magazine recorded 13.44 with minor preparation. These were the numbers that established the LS6 as the benchmark, the car every other manufacturer's engineers studied when they were trying to understand what the ceiling looked like. The LS6 Chevelle cost approximately $4,475 fully optioned. That was serious money in 1970, the price of a modest new home in several American markets. You paid for the engine, for the brakes, for the chassis upgrades that made the car usable at the speeds it could reach. You paid for the reputation, and you drove away with what most of the automotive press agreed was the fastest thing wearing a production car window sticker. Buick was not supposed to be part of this conversation. In General Motors' brand hierarchy, Buick occupied the space between Oldsmobile's practicality and Cadillac's luxury, a division whose buyers expected large, comfortable, quiet, and emphatically not the kind of car that showed up at drag strips on Saturday nights. Buick's engineers understood this. They also understood that understanding it and accepting it were two different things. The Grand Sport had existed since 1965 as Buick's performance answer, and it had been quietly competitive in ways the division wasn't allowed to advertise. But the 1970 GSX, the Grand Sport Experimental, was different. This was a purpose-built statement car in a choice of two colors, Saturn Yellow or Apollo White, with a hood-mounted tachometer, front and rear spoilers, and a graphic treatment that left absolutely no question about what the car was for. And under the hood, Buick's engineers had put an engine that the corporate structure had done everything possible to suppress. The Stage 1 option on the GSX cost $199, $199 over the base GSX price. For that money, you received modified cylinder heads with enlarged ports and revised combustion chambers, a specific high-performance camshaft, a recalibrated carburetor, and a functional cold air induction system that routed outside air directly into the 455 cubic inch V8 through a sealed hood scoop. The sum of those modifications produced an engine that Buick's engineering department knew was putting out somewhere north of 400 horsepower. The number on the window sticker said 360. That 360 horsepower rating was not an accident. It was a negotiated fiction between Buick's performance engineers and the corporate structure above them. General Motors had unwritten rules about which division could claim the most power, and Chevrolet held that position by arrangement rather than by merit. Buick couldn't say 450. Buick couldn't say 420. Buick said 360, sent the cars to dealerships, and watched what happened when customers actually drove them. There was one number Buick couldn't hide, and it was the number that mattered most on the drag strip. 510 pound-feet of torque at 2,800 revolutions per minute. That figure appeared in Buick's own technical specifications, published openly because there was no corporate rule that prevented a Buick from claiming more torque than a Chevelle. Horsepower was the headline metric the press cared about. Torque was the physics that determined what happened at the line. The difference between the Stage 1's torque and the LS6's torque was 10 pound-feet. 510 versus 500, a small margin on paper. The difference between where they made that torque was the actual story. The LS6 made its peak torque at 3,600 revolutions per minute, well into the power band, requiring revs to access the full force of the engine. The Stage 1 made its peak torque at 2,800 revolutions per minute. It hit maximum force almost as soon as the engine was under load. Off the line, from a dead stop, the 455 Stage 1 was pushing against the rear tires at full force before the LS6 had even reached its peak output zone. This is why the strip times came out the way they did. The LS6 Chevelle was a high-strung, high-compression engine that rewarded drivers who could manage it well, who could launch at the right RPM, manage the traction limit, and execute a textbook run. The Stage 1 was more forgiving. It planted the rear of the car into the pavement from the moment you moved the throttle and kept pushing through the full quarter mile. A moderately experienced driver in a Stage 1 would run a better time than a moderately experienced driver in an LS6 because the Buick did more of the work for them. Car and Driver ran both cars in 1970. The LS6 Chevelle went first, 13.76 seconds at 102.7 miles per hour. A strong run from an iconic engine consistent with other published tests. Then the GSX Stage 1, 13.38 seconds at 105.5 miles per hour, 38 hundredths of a second faster, nearly 3 miles per hour faster through the traps. And the Buick weighed more, approximately 3,950 pounds against the Chevelle's 3,830. The heavier car, with the lower rated engine, ran faster. The 0 to 60 number was equally stark. The GSX Stage 1 hit 60 miles per hour in 5.5 seconds. The LS6 Chevelle needed 6.0 seconds. Half a second is the difference between confident and embarrassing at a stoplight. Half a second in the car that wasn't supposed to be in the fight from the division that wasn't supposed to be making these kinds of numbers. Motor Trend ran the same test and arrived at similar conclusions, though their specific conditions produced slightly different numbers, as they always do. The consistency across multiple independent tests was what mattered. Every serious automotive publication that tested both cars in the same year under comparable conditions found the Stage 1 faster, not by a whisker, by a margin that required an explanation. The explanation was straightforward, and nobody at General Motors wanted to say it. Buick had built a better drag race engine than Chevrolet, not a more complex engine, not a more exotic engine, a better one, by the only measure that the people buying these cars actually cared about: elapsed time at the quarter mile. General Motors' response was exactly what you'd expect from a corporation that had spent decades engineering its brand hierarchy as carefully as it engineered its cars. The Stage 1's horsepower rating stayed at 360. Buick's advertising for the GSX was restrained. The car existed in the catalog, but it wasn't the subject of the factory-backed drag race program that would have made it famous. The production numbers reflected the corporate ambivalence. 1,026 GSX models left the factory with the Stage 1 option in 1970. In an era when the LS6 Chevelle sold in far larger numbers despite its higher price, Buick's superior performer barely existed in the production record. The insurance companies helped bury it further. By 1970, insurers had indexed surcharges to horsepower ratings, which meant that the Stage 1's official 360 horsepower number kept its rates artificially low. This was actually a benefit to buyers who knew what they had. You could insure a car that ran 13.38 at the strip as if it were a mild-mannered skylark. But it also meant that the Stage 1 never attracted the insurance industry outrage that had started killing the LS6 and other high-profile muscle cars. Nobody came for the Buick, because on paper, the Buick wasn't doing anything worth coming for. The LS6. Chevelle survived long enough in the public consciousness to become the definitive 1970 muscle car. The car that every other manufacturer measured against. The car that appears in every list and every ranking of the era's performance machines. It deserves that reputation. It was an exceptional piece of engineering that arrived at exactly the moment when General Motors had decided that performance was worth whatever regulatory or insurance consequences came with it. The GSX. Stage 1 didn't survive in the same way. One production year, limited numbers, a corporate structure that refused to let Buick say out loud what the car was capable of. The automotive press knew. The test data was published. The numbers were available to anyone who looked. But the marketing machine that creates legends in the muscle car world never fully deployed behind the Stage 1. It won the test. It lost the war for public attention. A numbers-matching 1970 GSX. Stage 1 in Saturn Yellow with documented history commands serious auction prices today. Well into the six-figure range and climbing as the story becomes better understood. There are fewer of them than LS6 Chevelle by a significant margin, and the combination of rarity, performance provenance, and the corporate suppression narrative that now surrounds the car has made it one of the more sought-after finds in serious muscle car collecting. The data was always there. Car and Driver published it in 1970. The Buick ran a 13.38. The Chevelle ran a 13.76. General Motors' most powerful engine lost to the car nobody was supposed to take seriously. And for 50 years, Chevrolet got the reputation while Buick got the time slip.